Oh, let's see, where were we? Um, okay, we stopped the first tape. Glenn and I went out to dinner. We came back and we watched the first part of the tape. And I've got to say I was shocked to see how old I look. Because I know I'm old, but I see myself in the mirror and I don't look that old. Glenn says that the light for this camera is very harsh and shows up every little tiny wrinkle. Okay, so much for that. The other thing I noticed on the tape is that I was rubbing my face a lot, and that seemed pretty crummy. I hope somebody doesn't think I have a nervous tic. It's just that Princess had been sitting on my lap, and even though I brushed her thoroughly earlier today, she still sheds those tiny little white hairs that get on your face, like right here, and they make you itch and you've got to rub it. So anyway, so much for that. I think we were at the point where my mom came back to the States and she went to New Mexico because that's where my Uncle Pete was, family, and she had to be with family. And Louis and I continued going to school. I liked going to school. I liked Guadalajara. I enjoyed the years that I lived there, which was around 4 years. I think my dad and I were the only ones that liked it. My mom, as I said before, hated it. Lupe left as soon as he could. And I don't think Louis was too crazy about it either. So I think it's just my dad and me that liked it. 3 younger kids, I don't think they really knew the difference. Anyway, my dad had to wait until all his paperwork was completed, which finally happened in early 1943, and we came back, I think it was around the beginning of February of 1943. We came back to El Paso. We stayed there a few days and then came to New Mexico where my mother was. And my dad and I only stayed in New Mexico a short time, and he and I came to California in search of employment, of course. I found a job right away. We came and stayed with my mother's relatives who lived in Los Angeles. And I'm just thinking right now, it hadn't occurred to me before, but the address where my mother's relatives lived was 144 South Utah Street, which is the same number of the house where my father was born in Mexico, 144. I hadn't thought of that before. I'm pretty sure that they were both the same numbers. Anyway, we came to stay with them. My dad went on to Oxnard because he had friends there who were musicians, and my dad was a musician. He made extra money as a musician. Anyway, he went to Oxnard to find a job there and to be able to play. He formed a little combo with the friends that he had there, and they used to play on weekends for birthdays, baptisms, etc., graduations, whatever. And I stayed with my mother's relatives here in Los Angeles and found a job downtown LA in the garment district in a factory that manufactured women's slacks. The name of the place was Tailored Slacks of Hollywood. Shortly before, I don't remember exactly when, but before the end of 1943, my dad and I had saved enough money to send for my mother and the rest of the children, except for Louis, who stayed behind with his godmother, and he came on a few months later. I don't remember exactly when. Maybe Louis remembers. Then my mom found an apartment not too far away from her aunt, and we went to live there about 2 blocks away from them. And I continued working at Tailored Selects of Hollywood. It was wartime. My mother got a job at Lockheed as a riveter. We used to call her Josie the Riveter. And she worked there only during the war. I think when the war ended, she stopped working. The rest of the kids went to school, and Lupe was still in the Air Force, and Louis, I don't remember if Louis went to school first and then started to work. I'm not sure. Anyway, eventually, for some time we lived in City Terrace. I don't remember which came first, the apartment on 356 South Glass Street or the house in City Terrace. I think the house in City Terrace came after. Then from there, Lupe came back from the service, and he enrolled himself in school. I don't remember which college he went to, but he was going to college. It might have been East Los Angeles Junior College, I'm not sure, which is now East Los Angeles Community College. I continued to work. By this time, I think Louis was working also. Louis worked downtown at a place called Jack Diamond. Louis and I, and then around this time, then we bought a house. Between Lupe and my dad and I, we all saved enough money, and we bought a house in East LA at 714 South Fresno Street. We lived there for quite a few years. The streetcar, the art car, which ran on Whittier Boulevard, which was a block away from our house on Fresno Street, was the mode of transportation that Louis and I used to go to work. We went and caught the streetcar together every day and went to work at each other's jobs. We did that for a long time. I remember one time Louis' company was having inventory, and so he had to go in earlier, so he left ahead of me. And I went and got on the streetcar at the same time. And every day we used to sit in the same seat. The same people were on the streetcar. Everybody knew us. We said hello to everybody. And I get on the streetcar by myself that day, and the people said to me, "Where's your twin?" And I said, "What?" And they said, "Where's your twin?" And I said, "Oh, you mean my brother. He's my brother, but he's not my twin, and he went early today because he had to do inventory." I never thought that they believed that we were twins. Anyway, that went along like that for a while. I'm not sure if I want to backtrack to something or if I want to go ahead to something more. Before we bought the house, when we were still living in the apartment, my dad was still working in Oxnard, and when he had gigs on the weekend, he would stay there and maybe come home just for half a day. And when he didn't, he would come home for the weekend. And I remember after a few months of that, he came home one weekend and he said to my mother, "Start packing everything because we're moving to Oxnard." And I was there, and I said, "No, we're not." And he looked at me and he said, "What did you say?" And I said, "We're not moving. I have a job, Mom has a job, and if you want to stay in Oxnard, you continue to stay in Oxnard, but we're not moving, we're staying here." I don't know where I got the courage to stand up to my dad and tell him we weren't moving, but we didn't. And he wound up coming back and staying here. He found a job in a furniture factory where he worked for the rest of his life until he retired, which was in 1965, because that's when he was 65 years old. So after that was when we bought the house on Fresno Street. Had some good times at that house, had some parties. I had my wedding shower there. To backtrack a little bit, when I was working at Taylor's Sex of Hollywood was where I met Joe. I had never noticed him, but obviously he had noticed me. Because one day I was at, I worked on one side, which was the sewing part of the factory, and he worked on the other side, which was the business side, shipping, receiving, and office work, and that's where he worked. And obviously he had noticed me because one day I was at the drinking fountain, and he came up behind me, and he said, hello, and I turned around and I said, hello, and he said, do you want a kiss? And it kind of surprised me, shocked me a little bit. I think I got a little embarrassed. And he must have noticed that I was embarrassed because he quickly brought his hand from around he had his hands behind his back. And he brought his hand back and he opened up his hand and he had a Hershey's chocolate kiss in his hand. So that was the first time that we ever talked to each other. From then on, we talked to each other now and then at the drinking fountain or at the lunchroom. And then we started taking walks together at lunchtime. And then he finally asked me out. The first time we went out together was a football game at the Coliseum. It was the Rams versus the Philadelphia Eagles. I remember it like it was yesterday. About the end of the third quarter, the Eagles were ahead 28-0. And so we were thinking that the Rams were going to lose. I wasn't that much of a football fan yet, but I did know a little about football because I had a boyfriend, his name was Bill Encinas, who played football for the football team at East LA College, and so I had gone to watch some of his games. But that was my extent of football. But Joe was a very avid football fan, so he was really feeling bad that the Rams were losing 28-0. All of a sudden, the Rams started scoring, and before the game was over, they scored 28 points, and so now the score was 28-28 tie. And that's how it ended, because back then there were no tie-breaking overtimes. If it was a tie, that was the end. So I remember that the sports broadcasters talked about that game for years. Every time the Rams were behind, they would say, remember back on October the 3rd, 1948, when the Rams were behind 28-0, et cetera, et cetera. And so I can't ever forget that date of that game, and that was our first date. And we got married about a year and a half later in July of 1950. Glenn, you think this is a good time to stop for now?
Good point.
Okay.
Tiki approves. You approve, Tiki?